So it's lesson 2 of advanced server-side scripting with Mean. And I was mentioning to Maggie and Nick and Ivan, who are here a bit early. Originally, I'd planned to assign a lab today that was going to be due next week, but I'm going to move that lab, and we're not going to assign it, and I'm not going to assign it until next week. So you still won't have anything due this week. So we want to look at basically 2 things today. We want to spend some time looking at closures. You probably touched on them really briefly in your class with Albert, but we use them all the time with Node, and basically all modern JavaScript uses closures. So my goal at the end of today is for you to be really clear on what is a closure, how and why do we use it in JavaScript. Okay? So that's going to be part of our class. And then the second part of class, we want to introduce and start using NPM, the Node Package Manager. Okay, so we're going to add a bunch of files today. We're going to work with closures first, and we'll deal with NPM later on. Okay, so I've put up a link here on Blackboard. This is a good article from medium.com. I'm not going to read the whole thing to you, but I'll put it up here as a reference, and I'm going to go through some of the things in here, and we're going to try some of the project examples that are here. You may need to sign in, like you can use a social media account to access the full article, but we basically want to try some of what's here. So I'm actually going to open up WebStorm and open up our project last week, because we actually used a closure structure in one of our files last week, but we didn't really talk about what the structure was and how it worked. So we should talk a little bit about closures, and then we can start to play around with them. So we've actually got a couple of closures Justin, that's an interesting question, probably not within the scope of today's lesson. So I'm happy to talk with you about that, but this probably wouldn't be the right time for us to have that conversation. So if you want to maybe send me an email, I'm happy to have that conversation with you another time. So if we look, here's our non-blocking file from last week. Can you see anywhere here where a closure function is being used, a closure structure is being used? I would say we have at least one closure. Yep, okay. You're right, Ivan. So line 7, we've got a closure. And yeah, and line 13. So what do you notice, like, what's strange about the syntax here on line 7 and 13 that we haven't really done before? If you think about you've taken 2 courses in JavaScript, what about the syntax is unusual? Right, so the parameter is odd, right? That's one thing. We have a function as a parameter. Yep. Okay, we've got the encoding. Yeah, that's different. True. There's also something in relation to the variables. Look at the variables used on lines 7 and lines 13. What's kind of weird about those? So here we've got a variable called food, but then we've also used the same variable in the same line of code in a different way. So first, we're assigning food equal to the result of this whole function, but then we're also using it inside as a parameter. And we've done the same thing with drinks. So this kind of structure is part of a closure. It limits, well, I guess I should ask before I say, does anybody know what a closure is? Have you heard this term before, or have any idea what a closure structure means? It's kind of the key to the asynchronous nature of Node. So what is a closure? And if you don't know, that's okay. We're going to spend lots of time exploring, but you can feel free to take a guess. Ah, yeah, Ivan, absolutely. It's around the scope. That's absolutely true. Can you explain a little more what you mean by the scope? Okay. So Maggie, right, it protects the inside of the function from change. Okay, so what it really has to do with is the scope of a variable in JavaScript. Where is it available? So the idea of a closure is a function like this one that refers to a variable from its parent environment. I know that may not make a lot of sense, but it has to do with controlling where a variable is available. Okay? So we're going to try a number of examples today. So this article kind of explains it. And this is an interesting quote from Douglas Crawford. He was actually the original developer of JSON. He said, you can write ECMAScript, you can write JavaScript without closures, but we're not really harnessing the power of the language, much like we probably wouldn't write Java code without using classes. So we're going to play around with this. It has to do with, as Ivan said, scoping of variables. So where are variables declared and where can we use them? So if we declare a variable outside a function, we can use the variable in the function, but we can't do the opposite. We can't declare a variable in the function and then access it outside. So the closure really controls when is a variable available. And you may wonder, well, who cares? Like, what difference does it make where we declare the variables? Well, we're going to write some code examples today so that we can see why. And we'll talk about it in context of some real world applications. Okay? So let's go ahead and make a new file for today. Okay. And let's see, what do I want to call this? Oops. So I'll go to my project. I'll make a new JavaScript file. I think I'll call this closure example 1. Doesn't matter what you name the file, nothing special about the name. So we're going to create a wrapper function with another function inside it. So we'll just create a general function. I'll call it parent. And in here, let's create a variable. Okay. We'll do this in steps. So let's just create a function. And right now, that function just declares and populates variable. So let's say Let's try this, console.log. So what's going to happen, I can just open up my terminal right here. It's kind of neat within WebStorm. I got my little console. So if we want to run this file, what result do you think we'll get? If I run the command node enclosure example1. Whoops. There's a couple possibilities. It will either print out hello world, or it could print out nothing, or I might get an error. What do you think will happen? Nothing? Okay, Barak, you think an error? Janelle, you think error? So Young says error. Okay, let's check it out. So, okay. It says message isn't defined. Okay. So, good point, Ivan. We didn't call the function. So what if we want to call the function first? So let's call it and then try to print the message. Just clear my terminal. So I'm going to run it again. What's going to happen this time? Are we going to get a hello world? Are we going to get nothing? Or are we going to get an error this time? What's your prediction? Right. Okay. Well, not quite nothing, but we don't have access to the message variable because it's scoped to the parent function. So this is kind of what in this case, the parent acts like a wrapper or encloses the variable. This variable only lives inside of parent. And best practices in JavaScript is we should be declaring variables typically inside of a closure or inside of a scope. We don't want global variables in JavaScript unless we absolutely need them. So this isn't going to work. So let's modify this a little bit. We'll come back and talk about, let's create in here a nested function. So our child function is going to log out the message. And then in here, we want to call it. So here we want to. So JavaScript lets us nest functions, one inside the other. What will happen if we run it this way? What will happen in the console now? Is it going to print hello world? Are we going to get nothing, or are we still going to get an undefined error? You now thinks nothing will happen. Other predictions? Hung, you think it will work? It'll have access and print message, the message variable. Anybody else want to make a prediction? What result? Okay, so Gina, you think the child doesn't have access to the parent? Well, let's try it. So I'll run my example again, and we get hello world. So in fact, any child function does have access to the variable in the parent scope. So the parent is our closure. Anything inside of this function, it will have access to that variable. Now, why do we care? Like, why is this relevant in the world of writing an application with JavaScript? How come it matters that we can declare a variable here, use it within the function, including any child functions? Like, yes, we see that it works, but what's the relevance of it? No problem, Janelle. Okay, Hung, we can declare the same variable. Well, the variable's in the closure, but we've got one function and then another one inside. Yeah, but rather than we could, but we only need to declare it once. So keep in mind, whenever we create a variable, it uses up, there's a performance cost. When you create a variable, the server allocates space in memory and then has to write the value in. Burak, right. So we can access an outer function from an inner function. So there may be things we only want to do once, but then we want to use that information to do something else, perhaps multiple times. Here's a classic example of this. We're building a web application where we need to send out an email to all our users, okay? And the email, some of the email content is going to be the same for everybody, and some of the email content is going to be unique to each person. So let's say our email has at the top, we want to set out like an introductory paragraph. Every email is going to have the same content at the top. Ah, yes, Hung, it would. I'm going to come back to that. Thank you for clarifying that. I'll come back to that in just a second. So we want like introductory text. We don't want to create that. If we've got to send out 10,000 emails, we don't want to create that introduction variable and populate the text 10,000 times. We only want to do it once, and we want to have that variable persist. But then inside of the loop, we need to personalize some part of the content of the email. Maybe, we want to include the user's email address and name in the body of the message. So this child function we need to change over and over again, but each individual email still needs the standard body text. So by using the closure, we can create the introduction text once and store it. And as we generate each individual email, we still have access to that parent variable inside. So we're not recreating the same value in server memory, create and destroy, create and destroy, create and destroy, which will slow everything down. So this nesting and the closure, it allows us to do that. Okay, now Hung, I'm going to come to your question. Great question. What if we do this? Oh, sorry. You're talking about if we redeclare it, I think, correct? So what will this print if we use the same variable name in the closure and in the nested function, in the parent and in the nested function? Right? So you're right, Barak. So how come this says goodbye world? Why do we get this result? So if we have two variables with the same name in the same scope, which one takes precedence? Right, it's always going to be the inner. The most local scope will always cascade. That's right, always. So the closure is a way of controlling, as Ivan said, the scope right? How long does this variable last for? And where does it have access to? Yeah, I guess I don't need to use var. I could use let. Sorry, Justin. Old habit. Thanks. I should use let. It's a good point. Now, I don't need to use the closure, right? I could declare, well, I could just declare this globally. Now, if I run it like this, I'm still going to get goodbye world, because obviously this is going to override this scope, and then this overrides this scope. So even if I do this, this gets ignored. This is considered really bad practice in JavaScript, though. Whenever we can, we want to be avoiding using global variables. And there's a whole number of reasons why we would want to avoid this, like I have on line 2. What would be some of the reasons that we should avoid? Okay, so Maggie, that's number 1. Yeah, it can be deleted or changed. Why else? Nick, yeah, you're on the right track. Can you just flesh that out a bit more? What do you mean by block scope? You're right. Aha, it's a waste of storage. Yep, hung. Right, if it's global, we can access it in a function, but yeah, we may have multiple names, so it can get confusing if we've got the same variable declared at different scopes. Okay. The value might also get passed from function to function, which can be hard to track it. And let's say we want to unit test one function. Well, it will mess up our unit testing if we have global variables that are getting passed. There's also a good chance, it could conflict with, common names or global names of global JavaScript objects, like let's say the window object or the document object. And as Hung said, it's a waste of storage, because if we declare it here, this variable gets created and has to persist for the full life cycle of the page. So, and it uses memory allocation. So as much as possible, we want to avoid global variables. So by using closures, it lets us avoid using global variables, but still share a variable within a certain scope that we need it. I'll just take this back out. Okay, so there's kind of our first example. Okay, so I think, based on the comments that you guys are making in the chat and what you already know about variable scoping, I get the sense that we're starting to get the idea. Am I on the right track? This is making some sense. All right, awesome. We're going to do some more examples. I've kind of adapted a few of the examples in this article. Some of them I've taken directly from the article. A couple of them we're going to adapt. So there's our first. Let's go ahead and make a few other files. Let's make a new file, by contrast, that we'll call open function. So it doesn't use a closure. Nick, absolutely, for sure. It's a good point. That's why I'm hoping if we do enough simple examples, it'll start to make sense. So it'll be a little easier to make sense of when we look at something more complicated. But yeah, we're going to start simple. Let's make a new JavaScript file. I'll call this one open function. And these next couple examples are straight from that tutorial on Medium. So we're going to create a function without any closure. So I'll just call this open function. Here I need to use var because we want to change the value. So var count, so we'll create a counter and we'll initialize it to 0. And then every time this function is called, we're just going to increment counter by 1. Here we need to use var since and then let's just log it out. Okay. So pretty simple function. Create a variable, initialize it to 0, add 1 to it, and display it in the console. So if we call this function twice, what values are going to show up in the console? We should get 2 outputs. What do you think before you run it? Give me a prediction. Let's predict. What will the output of this file be when we run it? Hung says 1 and 1. Justin says 0 and 1. Anybody else? What do you expect? 1 and 2. Okay, let's try it. And we got 1 and 1. Okay, Hung and Maggie, I'm going to put it to you. Right. Why? So Maggie, why do we get? Right. Because the first time we call it, our variable is created. It's incremented from 0 to 1, and it's printed. But the next time we call the function, right, the variable is initialized to 0 each time the function is called. That's right. The variable is block level. So it's redeclared every time. So we could call this function 1,000,000 times and it's going to print 1 every single time. Every time we create this, every time we call it, right, counter is set to 0 and then incremented. We want to rewrite this page, but this time we're going to use write. That's what we're going to do next, Maggie. So then we can kind of jump back and forth and look at the difference. Okay, so we're going to leave this file as it is. So in this case, it displays 1 every time as variable reinitialized in it to 0. So now we're going to rewrite this as a closed function, as a closed function using a closure. Make another file, call this one closed function. So this one we're going to call closed function. So again, we'll create a variable called counter and we'll initialize it to 0. Now to do this, we need a second variable. So I'm going to create a second one. This one I'll call increment. Really similar kind of synonym for counter. and we're going to set it equal to an anonymous function. The function has no name. And in here, we'll increment it and log it out. Whoops. And here I just want to say return increment. Okay, so we're going to return this variable when we're done. Now there's a couple ways we could execute this. How we want to execute this function twice. So how could we execute this one? Okay, let's try that. Well, let's try it the same way. Let's just execute it twice and see what happens. Okay, so when we call it now, we need to do a little bit more, actually. I'm going to create a variable called COMP2106, and I'm going to set our variable equal to the function. Set a variable equal to the function, then call it twice. So there's a couple ways we could do this. Yeah, the simple way is now we can just call our COUNTME variable twice. So this variable represents the function, and now I get 1 and 2. Because we're setting this equal to our function, it's only being called once. So this var counter, it gets initialized to 0 here, and then we execute the function. Just reading Nick's comment. That's the difference between just calling the function and then setting the variable to the function at right. So this is just creating a variable to represent the function, and then it actually is called twice. So here we've got our closure in action, that this is not being reset like it was in our open function example. So when we do this, things are persisting. The closure is keeping our variable present. We're not creating it and destroying it each time. So the closure keeps the value of our counter. So the first time we increment, we set it to 1 and we log it, that is being persisted now. So this is going to be more memory efficient, but it gives us a different result. So it's not that this code's wrong and this code is right. We have to think about what does our application need to do. So when might we use something like this? Let's say we're building a shopping cart and we're building the cart page to display all the items in the cart. So we might have like a running total, like an order total, we want to initialize to 0. And then we'd have a child function that would go and fetch each product, call that, maybe make a database call and go and fetch the quantity times the price and render or display that item on the page. But we also need to keep this variable as like a running total as we're doing this other processing. So then at the bottom of our shopping cart, we can actually display to the user the amount that they owe for their cart. So that would be where a common example of where we might use something similar. Or maybe we're doing a search page. We need to keep track of how many results it's the closure that keeps the value. It might be more clear like this. Let me do it this way. We could actually, call it like this. This might be more clear. So it gets initialized here to 0, but then we call the increment variable, we call the child function. This code is equivalent. This is probably a little more clear in terms of the syntax. What did I do wrong? Oops, is not a function. Hang on. Whoops. Just try it this way. Okay, hang on. I'm just going to undo that. Let me just put it back to how I had it for a moment. So yeah, this is just declaring it. It's not actually executing the function. So this is just the declaration. And then we're executing it twice. And because it's the same variable, that's basically initialized to 0 here. It doesn't get reinitialized when we execute it, because of the closure structure. So it's set up here at 0, and then it's run twice. So that variable actually stays. So I sort of borrowed, yes, it's saved in memory. So let's look here. I've borrowed this example from here. We can kind of look how they've done it. So the scope in memory here is enclosed in the wrapper function. So we're instantiating the function, but because this increment is local, it's inside, it keeps that parent value. So Nick's saying the count me variable is what's actually counting. That's right. It's the count me variable that's calling increment, and increment keeps that parent variable scope. It doesn't recreate it each time. So the counter is before, the variable is basically the closure here. We'll do, so it's a way of kind of modularizing our code. And this explanation at the bottom, this conclusion is important. It's not just nesting functions. It's about controlling the scope of variables against external change. So they can't get changed by another part of the page or application. And also, it gives us the ability to persist a variable only where we want to and make sure it doesn't get modified somewhere else. So we're instantiating it here, but it's when we call count me that this actually runs. It doesn't get executed until we actually call the variable we've assigned. So in a way, if we could think of it this way, if you are crossing a border, this here is taking your passport out of your pocket, right? You have your passport, you're ready to be checked. But this is the actual checking. It's the actual execution where you hand your passport to a customs agent and they actually look at it and decide, and they process it and decide what to do. So this is really just the setup in this case when we use the closure. With an open function, we don't have this setup. We just execute the function right away. But by assigning the function to a variable first, the variable is set up, but the function doesn't actually execute until we call it. So it's kind of a two-step process to use the closure. Set up and execute. With an open function, there is only one step. There's no setup. We just do a straight execution of the function. Okay. It's 10 to 1. Are there any other questions? We're going to play around a little bit more. I think these are the examples I wanted to try. Seems wasteful to keep it open in persistent memory. Well, typically we're typically only going to keep it open because we need it. I mean, realistically, we're not going to call it multiple times like this. There's probably not a lot of scenarios. But the scenario is a couple of the examples I gave earlier, that we have some data we need to share, and we need to share it to a nested function. So we want to just execute it that way, but keep that variable scope within the parent and child function. We don't want that variable accessible outside. So the closure does keep the memory usage to the lifespan of that function. Once the function's done, the variable's released. Sure, Nick. Yeah, we could do it in a loop. So, easily we could do this in a loop, right? Let's try it, right? So if we know we need to do this 10 times, oh, yeah. Okay, so we're doing it 11 times. So yes, you could use a loop here for sure. if we knew, or we had some variable, absolutely we can do it that way. Thanks for that suggestion. I'll leave it this way. Execute close function, we'll say multiple times. Yep, that's a good, I like that suggestion, Nick. I think that's a little more of a real world example that way. We have some other variable that we know we need. Okay, it's 5 to 1. I will push this up to GitHub. I'm going to stop my share and recording, go check my mail, and we will resume in 10 minutes.